He is the author of Rare Gems: How Four Generations of Women Paved the Way for the WNBA, which will be available now as the recording of this podcast. We welcome Howard Megdal onto Hoopsology. Welcome, Howard.
It's my pleasure to be here, Justin.
Pleasure to having you on the podcast. Really appreciate it. And before we hop into the book, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, since you were at the WNBA draft, how was the experience? I watched your latest podcast that you do covering the WNBA, and you mentioned that this was the first time fans was invited to the WNBA draft in quite a while. So can you just describe the ambiance? What was the energy like? Just because I know this year I would say is different than any other, just in terms of the excitement heading into the upcoming WNBA season.
It's been remarkable. It was the first, and we talked about over at the Lockdown Women's Basketball podcast, that it was the first with fans since 2016, which I also had the privilege to cover. But the league was a fundamentally different place back in 2016. There were questions about audience, about survival. There were no questions like that at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, where people were crowding in, where people by the thousands were tuning in to watch parties all over WNBA arenas. There were 17,000 people in Indiana just to watch the proceedings from afar. And yes, it was a festive moment with a TV audience that was the largest for any WNBA event, game or otherwise, since 2000.
Now, that's incredible. And I think that the timing of your book is quite appropriate in this new era of women's basketball, both college and professional. So, for our audience, can you give a quick summary of what fans can expect from your book, Rare Gems, and also just the ties to Minnesota as well? I find that pretty interesting also.
To me, the beautiful thing about getting to tell the story I did in Rare Gems is understanding the landscape of the modern WNBA requires knowing both how it works from a basketball perspective and how it works from a building a business perspective. And so there's been this overlap, this link through four generations effectively of women's basketball players, and their lives have overlapped and intersected in wonderful ways. Everyone from Paige Beckers and Caitlin Clark in the modern time. Paige, of course, grew up in Minnesota. Caitlin Clark grew up a huge fan of the Minnesota Lynx, was heavily influenced by watching her favorite player, Maya Moore. And so that Minnesota Lynx team did so much in the 2010s to be able to influence the modern game. Well, how did that team get built? It got built by Cheryl Reeve, now their head coach and general manager, and the head coach for all four of their WNBA titles, but also Carly Knox, who is their head of business operations. And you cannot build a team that just succeeds on the court without also building a women's basketball business. Well, they have been able to do it through not just that team, but specifically Lindsay Whalen, who came of age in Minnesota and changed the way we could think of women's basketball players and what they were capable of achieving from a fame perspective. From a basketball perspective, it's always been there. It's a fame perspective, in the early part of the 2000s at University of Minnesota, and then eventually with the Minnesota Lynx. And of course, her legacy and what she is built on was the type of things that we saw out of the generation of Cheryl Reeve, the player. And Cheryl Reeve, the player, was possible because of the growth we saw out of the hero of the book, Peps Newman. Peps Newman, somebody who in the early 1960s, before Title IX was a thing, before professional women's basketball was a thing, determined that she wanted to be a professional basketball player. She was laughed at, as you could imagine, at that time. And what Peps Newman was able to do, both as a basketball player, barnstorming the country, changed the way America thought of women playing basketball, but also what she built as a business eliminated some of the worst tropes there are about women's basketball not being profitable.
So I want to ask about this because I think the Minnesota tie is fascinating. Can you kind of describe this? Because our show is just about basketball culture as well, and understanding how the game is really popular in ways that I think a casual audience may not expect. So I think for Minnesota, what comes to sports fans' minds is hockey. At least that comes to my mind.
Mhm.
So in terms of basketball in that state. Can you kind of paint a picture of how popular the game of basketball is in Minnesota and how there might be some misconceptions of just, when a casual fan takes a look at the Timberwolves or the
Mhm.
Lynx, they may not think the game is popular. But as you outline in this book, and that's with our conversation here, it just has a huge, huge presence in that state.
Well, the Lynx, of course, are very popular and have been drawing significant audiences for many years, in part due to what Cheryl has built on the court and in part due to what Carly has built off the court as well. But one of the things I think is most interesting in Minnesota is that you see women's sports as a more significant part of that popularity. So it's a place that loves its basketball. Williams Arena, of course, where University of Minnesota plays, dates back to the late 1920s, one of the most remarkable places to see a basketball game. If you haven't been, I highly recommend it. And you see participation in women's sports equal in the high school level between girls and boys. And that all comes again directly from a tie that involves not only women's basketball being significant and how significant to the point that Lindsay Whalen, her first sport, her first love was hockey, but there was a pathway for her to be able to go play ultimately college and professionally and have a cohort of friends, which is the number one thing her parents were worried about in fifth grade, that she switched from hockey over to basketball. If we had had the women's hockey background that we have now in the state of Minnesota, Lindsay Whalen thinks that she may well have become a professional hockey player
Wow.
instead. And of course, we have that opportunity. So in all of those ways, it comes together where the basketball is very popular, but again, women are a significant portion of that popularity in Minnesota. And those legacies, again, date back to Pabst Newman, who before becoming a professional helped organize and revive interscholastic girls basketball play in the state of Minnesota in the early 1960s.
No, that absolutely is incredible. I think it's very interesting now, just in terms of the upcoming WNBA season, a lot of excitement. But as you mentioned, it took a lot of effort to get to this point and to
Mhm.
see the league evolve past 2024. So can you kind of lay out as best you can, kind of what you mentioned earlier in our conversation about the business practices of the WNBA improving, and how has the league been able to capitalize on not only just the Caitlin Clark momentum, but also the players that are still in college that are poised to go to the W. Like, can you kind of describe what improvements have been made from a league standpoint to now being able to capitalize on this momentum?
There's a few different ways, and some of it is external and some of it is internal, right? There are good decisions being made. I'll give you an example. We had the chance to talk to Kathy Engelbert on Monday night at the draft in New York, and she just sort of casually mentioned that not only is the tie between popular college players and the WNBA something that they are looking to encourage as much as possible, but there was an ad spend from the Sweet 16 on through the national championship game. And so part of that comes from the league being smarter with its money. I can't tell you how many league presidents prior to Kathy spoke about, oh, we want to make this tie. Well, okay, but you put an ad buy in place and you have the opportunity to do it. Part of it, of course, is that women's college basketball has been popular, but has become exponentially more so over the past couple of years. And it's an easy thing to say, oh, well, Caitlin Clark made it happen. And of course, Caitlin Clark is a spectacular player, and everyone is reaping the benefits of seeing that. But we are 2 years into the NCAA allowing the women's tournament to use March Madness branding. 2 years into
Wow.
that. The NCAA self inflicted decision not to allow it to happen. We are 4 years into ESPN broadcasting all of the women's tournament games. 4 years
Wow.
into that. ESPN2 has been a thing for quite a while. ESPN News and ESPNU have been things for quite a while. 4 years. And so when you create a landscape for this to happen, the thing I have long argued, and I believe this, it's a hypothetical because we'll never know. But if this landscape had existed in 2016, Brianna Stewart would have been what Caitlin Clark is now in terms of a national name, a four-time national champion, a four-time most outstanding player of the Final Four. Now, when you talk about the business practices, and I'm delighted, Carly was able to share so much of that with us to get into the ways in which the Lynx have operated. These are just sound, basic business practices, the type of things that we see in men's sports routinely. Investment instead of just simply dollar in equals dollar out, giving and putting a premium on the product. Something that Carly says I think about all the time is if you don't value your product, nobody else will. And that is as basic as it gets. And so that is something the Lynx have always done. They've been able to build a season ticket base that way. And we are seeing more and more other WNBA teams taking a lot of the best practices that the Lynx have operated under for years and utilizing them as well.
No, that is excellent. What you said is something that I have echoed as well as a criticism of the league in the past in terms of its popularity. I want to ask you specifically about the television coverage of ESPN because that's been a big sticking point of mine. I would say prior to the pandemic, and there's been a shift, and especially this year, they're seeing the tournament coverage for the women's side on ESPN and just seeing the highlights. And actually, I feel like the network's actually taking women's basketball seriously for the first time compared to his other counterparts. Can you talk about that? Because I'm a fan of all other sports, and even I'm a fan of mixed martial arts. And at one point, the UFC was not even on ESPN, but yet that got more coverage than the WNBA, who had a television contract on ESPN. So it just shows you kind of the evolution of the league. You got to discuss that in terms of from a television perspective, how ESPN has finally gone all in, like you mentioned, airing all of the tournament games on all of its networks.
I'd like to see all in. I'd like to see wall to wall coverage. Um, there's no shortage of people in the league who, if you want to get them to use obscenities, to simply talk about the fact that over the past 5 years, every single summer league game has been televised for the NBA.
Yep.
And there's no disrespect to the NBA Summer League, but it is ultimately an exhibition, a series of exhibition contests made up of largely players that are not even going to play in the NBA someday. And the fact that every single game was televised on ESPN, but we didn't see every single game or close to it televised on the WNBA actually ultimately cost ESPN because the WNBA was able to make deals with other streaming sites and other sites as well, whether it was Ion on broadcast television or even just Amazon Prime for the Commissioner's Cup. And the league was able to monetize in a significant way. But certainly, if ESPN had come to the WNBA 5 years ago and said, we'd like to broadcast every single game on the ESPN family of networks, that would have been all in. And so I'm still not seeing all in. We're seeing growth. We're seeing
Sure.
a significant shift. And it's great and it's wonderful to see. And there is a new television contract coming up. And in addition to that, reflecting the financial realities of women's basketball as it now exists, I certainly hope and believe that ESPN through ancillary programming, and again, they have just these incredible voices. Sinead Nwumake
Yep.
is a voice we should hear from all the time. Andrea Carter is wonderful. Rebecca Lobo is a national treasure. There are ways in which we need to be able to continue to hear from these folks as ancillary programming to go along with it. This is something ESPN does very well, but it reminds me a lot, again, we talked about that shift. I was covering women's soccer at the time. I still do. I was covering at the time of the 2015 World Cup, and Fox Sports got the rights to the World Cups, both men's and women's. At that time, they just threw in the Women's World Cup as like a nice little bonus for the Men's World Cup. And Fox Sports decided to treat it as essentially a pilot project. Oh, well, we'll do the ancillary programming and let's see that we're able to do it. So suddenly Alex Morgan was on The Simpsons and Abby Wambach was on American Idol. And wonder of wonders, when you do all this ancillary programming as well, you had the most watched soccer match in American history, men or women, north to 26 million people watching the World Cup final. And you saw people watching it the entire time. It's not rocket science. It's just these are really compelling games with really compelling storylines. Just give people a chance to connect to it. And we can eliminate forever this idiotic Venn diagram that people have always operated on. in so many corners of the sports world of, hey, there's this group of people who will watch men's and women's sports, and then a subgroup, and depending on how optimistic they are, the hands get smaller that'll just watch women's sports, or they'll just watch men's sports but not watch women's sports. And no one talks about the fact that there's a large group of people that are only going to want to watch women's sports, and that's okay too. But we have no idea how big that audience could be. I think everyone who has not been in the space for a long time keeps being shocked by it.
Yeah.
It's always been there.
Yeah, and it's pretty ridiculous because you see it in other sports too, from even women's tennis. You mentioned women's soccer. I've seen it with the UFC with Ronda Rousey. People that hated MMA that despised
Mhm.
it stayed up till 3 a.m. to watch her fight, and it was because of Ronda. So, and
Right.
that's the power of women's sports. I absolutely agree with you. With the upcoming rights coming up, and there was some rumors that Warner Brothers Discovery might be interested. Where do you see the best home for the WNBA? It's kind of a weird time just in sports, just in terms of streaming. Things are becoming more fragmented in terms of where sports fans watch their sports. Do you think the correct home is on ESPN, despite them still needing to improve their coverage, or do you think Warner Brothers Discovery might be the best home for it, just in terms of inside the NBA? Has been a big success,
Mhm.
echoing that to maybe a WNBA product, or do you think streaming might be the best way? Like, where do you think is the correct home once they get the rights finalized?
I think the lead should have a drum roll, and then at the conclusion of the drum roll, see whose oversized novelty check is largest, and related to it, where are they best able to be front and center and promoted. I mean, look, I joke about it. There's this balance you're going to have to strike between how much people are willing to pay and how big a platform they're able to get. I think the best possible option is something that simplifies how easily people can watch the games. And I think that matters, but you need to make sure you are not siloed and it doesn't become
Yeah.
prohibitively difficult to do so. Now, that said, you look at something like the Apple TV Plus model that Major League Soccer signed. And if you can get something like $250 million a year in order to do it for, frankly, a league that is comparably aged and sized and audienced, if you do apples to apples from 2023 to what Major League Soccer was, it's not a ridiculous idea to go and make a deal like that and take the huge sum of money that comes along with that and invest in any number of ways to improve everything from salaries to charter flights to investments in long-term infrastructure. There's a variety of ways in which that next TV deal is going to drive what Kathy Engelbert and the league are able to do for the remainder of the decade. And I would argue in a way that's going to set up the league for the next 30 to 50 years. That's the time frame that this type of money could be setting them up for. So there's not a single answer to that. ESPN could do it. There's no question about it. Warner Brothers Discovery could do it. There are a number of places where it could work best, but I think I am sure that Kathy Engelbert has seen the movie Jerry Maguire, and so, frankly, just needs to channel, Cuba Gooding Jr. and yell, "Show me the money," and see who comes up with it, and they all should, because that's the direction that things are trending.
So I want to ask you that this has been a criticism I have had of Kathy Engelbert, and I think I've seen it rectified only because of Caitlin Clark's popularity, and that is just pushing the league. Because I've been a fan of other leagues that they were totally criticized, and yet just that constant pushing of how great the athletes were eventually pushed it through to achieve its popularity. But yeah, I wasn't seeing that with the WNBA until Caitlin Clark. And I want to ask you, you mentioned Brianna Stewart back in 2016, and obviously the league was under different leadership. But in that time, do you think w- when you were covering the league, was there that much excitement around Brianna Stewart from just a WNBA perspective, like there is because of Caitlin Clark? Do you think that's a criticism of now the league is finally capitalized on pushing the stars that are in college basketball, creating that full tie between women's college basketball to the WNBA, but there has wasn't that the case in like 2016 and prior starts, because I think that's been a criticism of mine. It's just, hey, there's been women's great women's college basketball players forever. Like this is not a new phenomenon with Caitlin Clark. Like you said, she's a phenomenal player, but it's not like she's the first great women's college basketball player. They've been around for years and years. I just feel now the WNBA in particular, they're capitalizing on it really in a great way for the first time.
Well, I think that's a complicated question. I think there's internal reasons and there's external reasons. As I mentioned before, the league did not do anything like start taking advertisements as they
Yeah,
should have. I listen. I remember covering Brianna Stewart's Sweet 16 game in 2016, and they beat UConn beat Mississippi State 98-38. And it might have been the greatest single team performance I've seen in any sport I've ever covered. That Mississippi State team included Tierra McCowan, Victoria Vivians, both from played in the league, Morgan William, who should have played in the league in a just world, and were coached by Vic Schaefer, who was one of the best of his generation. So, should there have been advertising happening at that time? Sure. Did the league have the financial wherewithal to do it? That's a different question. Not necessarily. And being able to make that spend at that time would have required getting owners in the league on board for doing something that was more investment than dollar in, dollar out. And simply put, the thinking around women's sports was unambitious in a variety of ways at that time, which makes it more difficult to do so. If you're asking me whether within the league, the excitement around Brianna Stewart was the same, yeah, it was. That league knew what it was getting in Brianna Stewart at that time, but there are limitations on what they were able to do. And then you just talk about ESPN not I mean, yet they had whip around coverage at that time. We weren't able to see all the games. There was not ancillary programming that went along with it. And again, the NCAA at that time, we had things like the weight room blow up in
yeah,
2021, but those inequalities did not exist only in 2021. They existed in 2016. They existed at that time in time immemorial. And so you just sit there and you say, man, what about if they had been able to use the March Madness branding for the only one we've ever had in men's or women's college basketball, 4 championships, 4 most outstanding players. Leave aside that it's just the NCAA deciding to leave money on the table in the name of misogyny. I don't
yeah,
really know what other possible argument you have. It's just this self-inflicted wound, right, that goes
yeah.
along with it. But you just think, what a missed opportunity. And of course, I'm talking Brianna Stewart, but I could just as easily be having the same conversation with you about Asia Wilson 2 years later. We could still be having that conversation about Maya Moore and what she did in 2010 into 2011. You can go all the way back to before the NCAA even had an NCAA tournament and look at the great AIAW stars in the 1970s during the time when the NCAA said, oh, we're good. We don't need a women's tournament. And the AIAW comes and creates it itself. And so stars like Ann Myers Drysdale are playing in the AIAW tournament. Lucia Harris of the great Delta State teams playing and winning AIAW championships. What would have happened if the NCAA said, hey, we're going to market these players the same way we are marketing Lou Alcindor, later Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Bill Walton and that UCLA men's team? We'll never know, but I certainly have my doubts that anything other than self-inflicted patriarchy is to blame.
No, totally agree. Howard, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you for spending some time with us. Can you please let our audience know where they can find you on social media, where they can find your podcast, and then also where they can find your book as well?
Go anywhere books are sold. You can get Rare Gems. It's open. The pre-orders are happening now. It officially is released May 7th, but I am getting told by people that these are shipping early. So go ahead and get it out. Anyone who buys a book, send me a proof of purchase and your home address to howardmegdal@gmail.com. I'll be happy to send you a signed book plate in order to make every book a signed book. Go ahead and follow also on Rare Gems on our Facebook page. We're going to have some book events in our book tour to follow. I just can't urge you enough. Go to thenexthoops.com and you can follow all the work we're doing 24/7, 365 on women's basketball at the Next Hoops everywhere on social media, particularly Instagram and TikTok. And the Nine Sports, THEIX sports.com is where you can get the Nine newsletter, 6 different sports, one each day, 6 days a week. Women's soccer, tennis, basketball, golf, hockey, gymnastics. We are connected all 6 of those sports and making sure that you are inside what's being done across the world of women's sports.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Howard. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Justin.